All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our third virtual landmark lecture of 2021. My name is Katie, and I am the education coordinator at Tudor Place Historic House and Garden. Our 2021 landmark lecture series has explored distinctive aspects of Georgetown's history. Tonight, we are joined by Mark Hudson to learn about Civil War hospitals of Georgetown. Mark Hudson has served as executive director of Tudor Place since 2015. Prior to his service here, he was executive director of the Vermont Historical Society and the Historical Society of Frederick County in Maryland. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Communication Studies from the University of Kansas, a Master of Historical Administration and Museum Studies degree, also from KU, and a Master of Arts degree in Library Science from the University of Missouri. Since childhood, Mark has held an interest in the American Civil War, an interest that was stoked while living in Frederick, Maryland, at the heart of the Civil War. In addition to being a frequent visitor and an occasional guide at Civil War battlefields, Mark has served for several years on the board of directors of the Save Historic Antietam Foundation, an organization committed to preserving and protecting that hallowed ground. Mark and his wife, Julie, share their home in Arlington with a spirited Jack Russell Terrier named Flynn. So thank you, Mark, and feel free to start your presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you all. It's great to see all of you, and happy to share some of what I've learned about the Civil War hospitals of Georgetown. I am going to do a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to pull that up on the screen for you. So the title of our program is Town of Wounds, Sickness, and Death. And this title is from an observation by Walt Whitman, who said that this little town, as you might suppose it, off there on the brow of a hill, is indeed a town, but of wounds, sickness, and death. And even though Whitman was describing the scene at Finley Hospital, northeast of Washington in December 1862, the same could be said for Georgetown during that same month. During the Civil War, Georgetown was the site of 7 hospitals that were located in churches, schools, warehouses, and other buildings. In this evening's program, I'll share with you information and stories from these sites and discuss Tudor Place's role in the operation of Civil War hospitals. But before we do that, before we start talking about the hospitals, I want to set the stage a little bit by just describing to you a little bit of what was happening in Washington, D.C. at the time, and particularly in Georgetown as well. So thinking about the District of Columbia in 1860, right before the start of the Civil War, had a total population of about 75,000 residents. About 60,000 were white and 15,000 free and enslaved blacks. And although it has been the nation's capital for over half a century, it really remained an unfinished city in many respects. A lot of commentators at the time, people who had visited here noted both the smell of sewage and the poor condition of its streets. One of these, and this is a quote you see quite often, but one of these is Anthony Trollope, the English novelist, described it in this way. He said, "Washington is but a ragged, unfinished collection of unbuilt, broad streets. Of all the places that I know, it's the most ungainly and the most unsatisfactory." And contributing to this perception were 2 unfinished landmarks in the area, the Capitol Dome and the Washington Monument. Funding concerns and the death of the architect Robert Mills had halted construction of the Washington Monument in the mid-1850s. So at this point, only the first 156 feet had been completed. And the same work in progress also was the Capitol Dome. Work on the present Capitol Dome had begun in 1854, and despite the disruptions of the war and the need for the steel that was being used in its construction, President Lincoln and members of Congress believed the continuation of this construction was important as a symbolic measure for the nation, with one senator arguing the country was strong enough to put down this rebellion and to put up this, our capital, at the same time. So work continued through 1863, causing Lincoln to remark, "It is a sign we intend the Union shall go on." In a ceremony marking the completion and placement of the Statue of Freedom atop the Capitol, dome took place on December 2nd, 1863. Throughout his presidency, Lincoln was concerned about the security of the city, being located across the river from the Confederate state of Virginia over here, and really being surrounded by the border state of Maryland. So as a result, DC became a fortified and really a militarized city. And this map from the Park Service shows you the location of some of the the major forts. And so there was really a ring of forts all the way around Washington. And so by the end of the war, there were 68 of these forts, 93 batteries with over 800 cannon that surrounded the Capitol. One of the things that's pretty cool is that there are still some remnants of those forts here as well. I think the most complete one is Fort Stevens, which is in Northwest Washington. And it is a site that's operated by the National Park Service. So you can go there and see the original earthworks that are there, as well as some reconstructed fortification and cannon, and get a sense of what one of those fortifications was like. On the Virginia side, there's Fort Marcy on the along the George Washington Parkway, and there's some great hiking trails in there, and you can see some of the original earthworks that are there as well. So again, remember, with all of these forts, those also have to have soldiers garrisoned there. So there was a tremendous need for soldiers here. And then there were many other personnel that were needed to oversee the nation's war efforts, as well as soldiers being mustered here in Washington. And so the military presence in Washington, D.C. really throughout the war was substantial. Now, although the municipal governments of Washington and Georgetown continued in operation, they were often subordinate to the military authorities at the time. And one aspect of this, as you will see, is the procurement of private property to serve military purposes. And what we'll be talking about this evening are the hospitals that were private property that was taken over for hospitals. So let's talk a little bit about Georgetown as well. So Georgetown was a separate municipality in the district throughout the war. The consolidation with Washington didn't happen until 1871. So in the 1860 census, there were 8,700 people in Georgetown. Of the 1,977 Black residents, 1,400 were free and 577 were enslaved, which was quite unusual for the number of free Blacks to far outnumber the number of enslaved. And then about 6,700 white residents of Georgetown as well. And unlike Washington, Georgetown, it had been around longer, and it really reflected something that's more complete. And this is a map from right around that time, 1860. And so you see it's got a whole system of roads and quite a bit of building that was going on. So it was really, Georgetown at this time was a combination of industrial, commercial, residential, religious, educational buildings that were lining the streets and the waterfront. This was also the beginning, or depending on which direction you're going, the terminus of the C&O Canal. And it was one of the approaches to the federal capital, to the Union capital from Confederate Virginia. So in those respects, Georgetown had some military significance as well. This is a really cool view that was taken from the other side. So this is on the Virginia side, looking over into Georgetown. And so you can see that a substantial number of buildings along the waterfront, and then of course the Georgetown College campus. And I think it is worth noting what was happening at Georgetown College at the time. The war was rather disruptive. First, it depleted the student population of the college. I've seen one place where it noted that the numbers dropped from 313 to 17 between 1858 and 1861. And Students and alum from the school fought on both sides. A lot of the students went south and fought for the Confederates. Georgetown also, the town of Georgetown was populated by a lot of secessionist and Confederate sympathizers. And some of those people fled, went south at the outbreak of the war, and there were some who stayed in defiance. I want to talk just a moment about the sort of the scene leading up to the war with respect to the care of sick and wounded. And really consideration for the care of the sick and wounded had been a secondary consideration for the US military prior to the Civil War. But at that time, there were a lot of new evolutions in medicine and lessons that had been learned from the Crimean War that had been fought just a few years before the start of the American Civil War about how to treat mass casualties. And really the last experience that the US Army had, that the US government had, was the Mexican War, which was about 15 years earlier. So early hopes on the Union side of a quick resolution to the conflict were set aside, of course, after the First Battle of Bull Run or Manassas in July of 1861. That was followed by illness and battle casualties from McClellan's inconclusive Peninsula campaign in the spring of 1862 that demonstrated to the Army really the staggering scale of the medical needs that would lie ahead for the Army. So with this being the case, you had, again, three types of soldiers needing medical care in Washington. Those who were passing through, who were being mustered into the service here, those who were garrisoned in the fortifications, and then after the commencement of major hostilities in the summer of 1861, those who were wounded in battle. So to accommodate the need for proper medical care, the federal government built 5 pavilion-style hospitals in the District of Columbia, beginning in 1862 and completing these into the early months of 1863. And these were actually generally well designed with proper consideration for hygiene and ventilation. And they really were working with the medical staff and the US Sanitary Commission in building these hospitals. And so the pavilion hospitals had capacity for over 4,500 patients. I think it was about 4,600 patients total. So this is the Armory Hospital. And as I understand it, this is located around where the Air and Space Museum is currently, then down around the mall. This was one of the larger ones, and I think is the best known of the pavilion hospitals. Part of that is because this is where the poet Walt Whitman offered comfort to the sick and wounded soldiers. And this was something that, again, this is a very famous image of the inside of the Armory and Armory Hospital. And this was where Whitman gave offered comfort to sick and wounded soldiers. And this inspired him. He wrote a lot of poems. One of them is the one that you see at the entrance to the DuPont Circle Metro station. So if you've ever gone up and down the escalator there's this poem by Walt Whitman about his experience in these hospitals. It goes like this: thus in silence, in dreams, projections, returning, resuming, I thread my way through the hospitals. The hurt and wounded I pacify with soothing hand. I sit by the restless all the dark night. Some are so young, some suffer so much. I recall the experience, sweet and sad. So before these large pavilion hospitals were complete, there were other buildings throughout DC that were procured to serve as hospitals, and 7 of these were located in Georgetown. So this map gives you a sense of the layout. There was a cluster of them here in the area around 30th and M Street, one over here more toward the waterfront, on Dumbarton Street, the church at Georgetown College, and Trinity here. We'll talk about each of these, and I've marked in blue up here where Tudor Place is, just to give you the context. So again, this was the extent of the center of Georgetown at that time in 1861. So the most prominent, perhaps, and the best known of the Georgetown hospitals, there were two of them that were best known: the Union Hotel Hospital and Seminary Hospital, and both of those were located on 30th Street. I'm going to talk first about Seminary Hospital. This was located on Washington Street between Gay and Dumbarton. So today we would know that as 30th and N Street, between N and Dumbarton. One of the things that is, to me, distinctive about Seminary Hospital, this is one of the few places where you actually have, of the Georgetown hospitals, you have an image of it actually serving as the hospital. So this is a photograph that was taken, I think, in April of '65, if I remember correctly. And these are primarily Union officers at the steps of the hospital. It's been identified as the officers' hospital. And again, it's the only one that I could find a photo like this. It opened in June 1861 and remained in operation until after the end of the war in 1865. So of all of the hospitals in Georgetown, this was the one that was in service the longest. So beginning in June 1861, around the time of the first Battle of Bull Run, up even beyond the end of the war in June of 1865. Now it's referred to as the Seminary Hospital because it had previously been Miss Lydia English's seminary, and this is the happy Miss English. Although she continued to reside there, she had turned control of the school over to Miss Harrover in 1859. And at that point, it became more commonly referred to as the Georgetown Female Seminary. So the government seized control of it in the spring of 1861. Miss Lydia English's Confederate or Southern sympathizing may have had a factor in why that was why it was taken over by the Union Army. We know quite a bit actually about the Seminary Hospital. It was a three-story building, was 178 feet long. So this frontage, what's now 30th Street, 178 feet long. There were two wings that extended, one in the center and then one off on the south side. And it had a total of 45 rooms, if you don't count the basement. So 32 of these were used as the actual hospital wards, where there were beds for the sick and wounded soldiers. And then the other 13 rooms served in various capacities as kitchens, dining rooms, bathrooms, offices, storage space, and then a few things that were particular to the medical functions there as well. And one of the best sources of information that I found about some of the activities at these hospitals were local newspapers, and in particular the Evening Star in 1862, right around Christmas time of 1862, had a series of articles that described things that were happening at the hospitals. And it described Seminary Hospital as well adapted for hospital use, kept in tip-top order, and a mutual goodwill seemed to pervade officers and patients. So a very positive perspective on the Seminary Hospital. So this brings us to one of our primary connections with Tudor Place and the hospitals of Georgetown. So it was at Seminary Hospital where we find, by way of Dr. Armistead, Peter, this connection to Tudor Place. Dr. Peter, try to explain this, Dr. Peter was the son of George Peter, who was the younger brother of Thomas Peter of Tudor Place, and the son of George and George's third wife, Sarah Freeland. So George had children very late into his life. After the war, Dr. Armistead Peter married his cousin, Marky Kennan, the daughter of Britannia Kennan, the owner of Tudor Place. And it's through this marriage that the Peter name comes back to Tudor Place. So when the war began, Armistead was studying medicine. He graduated from Columbian University, now the George Washington University, in 1862. And given the family's southern leanings, he first attempted to enlist in Alexandria as a surgeon for the Confederacy, but he was reportedly declined. And I've seen different sources say different things. One source said it was for a medical reason, a medical condition. Another said that the Confederate officers determined that they had more surgeons than they needed. In either case, when he returned to Georgetown, he learned that he had been drafted to serve in the Union Army as a surgeon. So he served as a surgeon at the Seminary Hospital throughout the war, although he was called away briefly in September 1862 from Seminary Hospital to organize the Waters Warehouse General Hospital on the Georgetown waterfront. We'll talk a little bit more about Waters Warehouse a little bit later. One of the interesting things that we found, and I think Rob is on the call, our curator Rob found this for me. His day book, Dr. Peter's day book in the Tudor Place archive, documents the fact that he had a private medical practice going on at the same time that he was serving as a surgeon at the hospital. And I think this also provides us an opportunity to mention that most of the surgeons who were serving in the Union and Confederate, on the Confederate sides, were not trained in military medicine. I mean, think about this. Most of them had never treated a gunshot wound, and most of them had never amputated a limb. And so for most, their skills treating battlefield wounds came through on-the-job training. And so beginning for him in 1862, obviously his skills in military medicine were increasing as the war went on. So regarding his experience here, Dr. Peter told his son, the seminary hospital was far from being what a hospital should be, but that one had to do the best one could do with what he had. So making do with that. Now, Seminary Hospital is still around. So if you walk up or down 30th Street between N and Dumbarton, you'll see it today as the Colonial Apartments. And I think it stopped being a seminary and never served as a seminary again. It became apartments by about 1870. And there is a pretty neat little plaque outside the Colonial, describing its history, including its years as a Civil War hospital. So that's one of the hospital sites that you can still visit, again, on 30th Street. So the next one I want to mention is the Union Hotel Hospital. And this was affiliated administratively, and I don't fully understand exactly how this worked, but it was affiliated with the Seminary Hospital, Union Hotel. It was located about a block and a half south at the corner of Bridge and Washington Street. So today we would know that as 30th and M Street. And I think it's accurate to say the Seminary Hospital was for officers and Union Hotel was for enlisted men. It was in operation from May 1861 until March of 1863. So it was one of the very earliest hospitals, but didn't serve through the whole war like the Seminary Hospital. Give you a glimpse of what it looked like. The original hotel was built in 1796, and it was considered one of the finest hotels in the city when it was first built. After a fire in 1832, it was renovated from its original federal style to Greek Revival, which I think is partly what you see represented here at the time of the Civil War. So just as a point of illustration, on the left side of it going up here, this would be 30th Street, and then running in front of it is M Street, as we would call them today. Some of what we know about the operation of the Union Hotel Hospital is from the writings of Louisa May Alcott, who volunteered here as a nurse for several weeks in late 1862 and early 1863. While she was here, she contracted typhoid, causing her to become very ill and requiring her father to eventually come down from Massachusetts to retrieve her and take her safely home. But during her time at the hospital, Alcott penned letters home that were first published in a Boston newspaper and then later published as hospital sketches. And this was, as a book, this was what gained Louisa May Alcott some of her first notice in the literary world. So this was viewed through the eyes of her autobiographical protagonist named Tribulation Periwinkle. Her hospital sketches provide a vivid and generally a critical assessment of the hospital. Early in her narrative, she expresses disappointment at not securing a nursing position at the Armory Hospital that we spoke of earlier, by noting that a much less desirable position at the Hurly-Burly House was offered instead. And that was her nickname that she used for the Union Hotel Hospital throughout the narrative, the Hurly-Burly House, I suppose, noting just a bit of the chaos that took place there. So she first reports upon arrivals from the Battle of Fredericksburg that was fought in mid-December 1862. And she described her duties rather dryly as wash, dress, feed, warm, and nurse. And her complaints about the conditions, about the management of the facility, and even the ingratitude of the soldiers lace this whole narrative. The first thing I met was a regiment of the vilest odors that ever assaulted the human nose, she noted. Her narrative also gives a glimpse of the chaos in the hallways, but identifies usefully some of the people who were there. Having been run over by 3 excited surgeons, bumped against by migratory coal hods, water pails, and small boys, and hopelessly entangled in a knot of colored sisters coming to wash. She concludes the narrative, however, with positive words for the surgeons who she describes as treating her with the utmost courtesy and kindness. But noting Hurly-Burly House has ceased to exist as a hospital, so let it rest with all of its sins upon its head. Now, among the recollections recorded by Armistead Peter Jr., son of Dr. Armistead Peter, were some about his father's service during the Civil War, and particularly mention of Alcott. And remember, Seminary Hospital and the Union Hotel Hospital had this sort of joint administrative structure. So he very likely had contact with her. And so he shared some thoughts about his experiences with Louisa May Alcott. And I share these with apologies to any members of the Louisa May Alcott fan club who might be with us this evening. He said, Miss Alcott suddenly appeared there as a nurse from Massachusetts. She was about 18 years old. She had no experience with hospital work and knew nothing about nursing. From the beginning, she found fault with everything and made no end of trouble. Regarding Alcott's affliction with typhoid, he said, everyone was sorry because of her illness, but no one regretted her absence from the hospital. So not a fan of the writer. Another Massachusetts native who served as a nurse at the Union Hospital was Julia Kendall from Plymouth. Arriving in Washington in June 1862, she was assigned to the Union Hotel Hospital. In one incident, she and another nurse witnessed a hospital steward locking unruly patients in the cellar. They were so outraged, they took their complaints to Secretary of War Stanton, leading to the arrest of the orderly and an end to this inhumane practice that had apparently been going on at the hospital. But regarding her role as a nurse, Kendall noted in a letter, the dust and stain of the battlefield made them all sacred in my eyes. I thought only how bravely and faithfully they had done their part, and the time had come now for me to do mine. The Evening Star newspaper offered a report upon Christmas activities at the Union Hospital in 1862 when the patients were served a feast that had been prepared by the matron and assistant matron of the hospital with food that had been provided by residents of Georgetown. The hallways were decorated with wreaths and evergreens to give the place a festive appearance. Goes on to inform us that Doctors Stipp, Ottman, Fitzpatrick, Smith, and Cromwell were the attending physicians and F.R. Guger the attending steward. And it concludes by noting that the Union Hotel Hospital is in excellent condition. And this is a wonderful image that was in Harper's, and it provides us a view of the interior of the Union Hotel Hospital, remembering that this had been a hotel. So this was referred to as the chandelier room. So I imagine it was a ballroom or some kind of a entertaining space there, but lighted with these chandeliers. Union Hotel Hospital closed in March 1863, and the patients from there then were transferred to other general hospitals in Washington. Unfortunately, the hotel was the victim of a bulldozer and a wrecking ball in 1932, and the lot became a gas station. But if you would like to visit the site, you go to 30th and M Street, you can visit the SunTrust Bank, and that is the site of the Union Hotel Hospital. Next, I want to start talking about some of the churches that served as hospitals. The first of these, located just right across the street from Union Hotel Hospital, was the Bridge Street Presbyterian Church Hospital. And this was, as I said, one of 3 churches that were enlisted to serve as hospitals during the war. It had opened in late August 1862. And like many of the hospitals in Georgetown, it was called into service to treat the wounded from the Second Battle of Manassas that was fought August 28th through 30th, 1862. The Presbyterian Church Hospital remained in operation until the end of 1862. And again, this Christmas edition of the Evening Star shares some details about this. The dinner having been provided by the liberality of Mr. S.T. Snow of Boston. The decorations throughout the church are described in detail in the article as well. At the altar were wreaths and crosses, and all around the building were mottos, shields, etc., while 2 muskets crossed on either side, giving the room somewhat of a military appearance. The building had been erected originally in 1821 and later moved to the congregation's current location on P Street. So on P between 31st and 32nd Streets. And there's a plaque in front of there. It doesn't talk about about its service as a Civil War hospital, but does give you a little bit of a history of the church. Tells us the congregation was founded in 1780, chartered by Congress in 1806, and it's the longest unbroken ministry in Washington. So when the hospital closed, its patients were sent to Harewood General Hospital near the Soldiers' Home in Northwest Washington. Next is another church on Dumbarton Street, immediately west of High Street, which is today's Wisconsin Avenue, is the Dumbarton United Methodist Church, site of a Civil War hospital from October 1862 until early January 1863. And as with other hospitals, the 1862 Christmas edition of the Evening Star provides some details, telling us a lavish supply of provisions were provided by Mrs. Caleb Smith, wife of the Secretary of the Interior, including oranges, other fruits, and delicacies for the 125 patients at Dumbarton Hospital. The article concludes by noting this hospital also deserves particular attention for its neat and cleanly condition. So these articles in these pieces in the Evening Star often end with these very glowing reports of how clean and how clean the hospital is and how happy all of the patients are. And the sign there tells us a little bit more about the history of the church. The building was constructed in 1849. Renovated in 1898, and on March 8th, 1863, the President Lincoln attended a service there. The third church, and this one operating at the same time as Dumbarton Street, Trinity Church General Hospital, was located at Langan Street, which is now 36th, between 1st and 2nd Streets. So between N and O Streets and on 36th. Again, the Evening Star tells us that 106 patients partook of Christmas dinner there that was provided by Mrs. Smith. And it said the convalescents gathered around a table and the sickest ones being supplied in bed. And it goes on again to describe the holiday decorations as festoons and wreaths of evergreen. And just a little bit about the Holy Trinity Parish dates from 1787, and the church building that was used as a hospital was completed in 1851. This building still serves the congregation today, so it is another one of the sites that you can visit. It went into service on October 16th, 1862, to provide a continuation of care for patients from the Waters Warehouse General Hospital that I mentioned earlier that Dr. Armistead Peter had gotten started, and it only which had only operated for a month. Again, treating casualties from the Second Battle of Manassas. So Trinity Hospital then closed in January of 1863. So again, fairly brief service. So I mentioned next the Waters Warehouse General Hospital, and this is one. It was only in operation for about a month, so I don't have a lot of information about it. We do know it was housed in the Waters Tobacco Warehouse that was located on High Street, so along what's today Wisconsin Avenue between M and K Streets. And like many of the other hospitals, it had opened to treat casualties from the Second Battle of Manassas. Opened in September 7th of 62, and then closed a month later on October 10th of 1862. And as mentioned earlier, then its patients were transferred to the Trinity Church Hospital. But here again, we find this connection with Tudor Place. Dr. Armistead Peter being called away from being a ward surgeon at seminary to come here and open the Waters Warehouse. And apparently he was unhappy. I think this is in one of the memorials to him. He was unhappy with this assignment and requested to be returned to seminary hospital. And I would just say, if any of you out there know more about the Waters Warehouse or about this hospital, I would certainly welcome any details. I had a great deal of difficulty finding out much. And I think part of it is just that it was an operation so very briefly, but I think it is interesting to think about converting a tobacco warehouse into a hospital. So that must have been quite a challenge doing this. Our final hospital site is Georgetown College. Now, early in the war, Union soldiers were quartered here, and several campus buildings were later used as the college general hospital that was in operation from September 4th, 1862 until February 28th, 1863. When it closed, its patients were distributed to other hospitals. Some of what we know about this hospital is, again, through the newspaper accounts in December 1862. Here we learn there were 295 patients who enjoyed Christmas dinner, provided again by Mrs. Caleb Smith and others. And again, the dining room was decorated seasonally and the patients given a lavish feast. The article goes on to describe the facility, saying the wards are all neat and clean, and the patients as happy and contented as they could be under the circumstances. Now, someone offering a differing view than that about being happy and contented was Private John Durr. And again, this is a view of the campus. Private John Durr, who offered a different view about his experience at the Georgetown College Hospital. He had been wounded at Second Manassas and was trying to recover there when he wrote to mother and father on October 16th, 1862, telling them, "I let you know that my wound is healing nicely, but I don't think I will come home, for I can't get no furlough. I don't think so, so I have to stay my 3 years. I'm afraid if I live that long. Soldiers are poorly taken care of, I can tell you." So not a happy patient at the college. And as I mentioned earlier, the war had a tremendously disruptive effect on Georgetown College, first with the departure of students, then the quartering of soldiers, and finally the operation of hospitals, or a hospital in the college buildings. To counter some of the economic effect of these disruptions upon the college, President John Early kept a count of the wounded soldiers and kept track of the square footage of rooms that were used for hospitals and documented every bit of damage. And so later submitted a bill for reimbursement to the Office of the Quartermaster General. And guess what happened? It went unpaid, but he did make an earnest try to recover some of the losses that they had suffered during the war. So here's a quick summary of the 7 hospitals. Seminary was in operation the longest, from June of 1861 to June of 1865. And these numbers are based upon a variety of different sources, but tried to get a sense of how large each of them was. So about 120 patients there, 120 beds. Union Hotel from May of 1861 until March of 63, about 200 beds. Presbyterian Church, just August to December of 62, 115. Dumbarton Street, October 10th of 62 to January of 63, 125. Trinity Church, October, again of 62 until January 63, about 100. I don't have any idea of the number of beds at Waters, but I suspect because their patients were transferred to Trinity Church, probably around 100 beds there. It was just in operation for a month. And then Georgetown College from early September until late February of 63, and about 295. So if you add all this up, it's about 1,000 beds or 1,000 soldiers who could have been treated here. Again, most of these hospitals were called first to treat the casualties from Second Manassas and then from the Battle of Fredericksburg. But by early 1863, the 5 pavilion hospitals, the very large pavilion hospitals that I talked about earlier, were complete, providing a lot of beds. So really, asking the question, why were so many of these hospitals around for just such a brief time, from the late summer of 1862 up until maybe late 1862 or 1863? And I think there are a number of answers to that. One, again, is the pavilion hospitals being complete and being called into service. And it's also important to note, too, that the manner in which the Union Army was addressing the care of the wounded after the battles was changing at this time as well. A lot of this is due to the leadership of a man named Jonathan Letterman, who was the medical director of the Army of the Potomac. And so wounded were able to get better care at field hospitals and actually on the battlefield, but at field hospitals near the sites of battles. And I would say, just generally, as I said earlier, many of the surgeons had no experience with military medicine, but they gained experience as the war went on. So generally, the care of the sick and wounded improved throughout 1862, and changes in the management and the greater experience by the surgeons and the nurses. So because of this, these temporary hospitals were not as essential as they had been. So that's a little bit about the hospitals. I also want to touch a little bit on the connections between Tudor Place and the operation of these hospitals. And this is a very early image of Tudor Place. You notice we don't have the kitchen addition on the west side. So this is obviously well before 1876. But at the outbreak of the war, Britannia Kennan, who was owner of Tudor Place, had to alter her plans. She'd planned to travel north, but as a slave-owning Southern sympathizer and actually a cousin of Robert E. Lee, she and her daughter Marky decided to travel south. They stayed first in Stanton, Virginia, then Richmond, and on to Petersburg. And while they were there, she learned that private homes and other buildings were being confiscated in Georgetown and in other places by the Union Army. Among the concerns that she immediately had was the fact that Georgetown Seminary had been confiscated to serve as a hospital. And this was significant because she'd made arrangements to store some personal items in there while she was away from Tudor Place. And these included some of the objects that had belonged to George and Martha Washington that are really the keys to the Tudor Place collection here. So her cousin Robert Dick came to the rescue and removed these items and sent them on to another storage space nearby. She was also distressed at this time to learn that her cousin's home, Arlington House, was being confiscated by the Union Army. She sent wagons to the estate to retrieve heirlooms, and a lot of these things that had been at Arlington House were stored here in the Tudor Place attic during the war. So she was in Petersburg, and through this circuitous route, she and Markey returned to Tudor Place on January 1st, 1862. And to prevent Tudor Place from becoming being confiscated, perhaps becoming a hospital, she began taking in Union officers as boarders that spring. And there are a lot of family stories about life at Tudor Place during the war. And most important, though, was her rule about discussing the war. As she reflected in conversations with her grandson many years later, I always told them that I was aware of their sentiments and that they were aware of mine, and that I should not intrude my feelings on them, and I should expect the same of them. Before me, they never discussed the war and showed me every consideration. So among the tenants, this is quite interesting. Among the tenants at Tudor Place during the war were several people associated with the Union Army's medical service. The first is Mary Diggs Lee Letterman, wife of this man, Dr. Jonathan Letterman, who I mentioned earlier as the father of modern battlefield medicine. The couple were newlyweds, having just been married at Needwood in Frederick County, Maryland in October 1863. So while Letterman was out serving in the field, his wife resided at Tudor Place in November and December of 1863. And so we suspect Dr. Letterman probably visited her here at Tudor Place when he was in Washington, D.C. Dr. Charles Carroll Lee was the brother of Mrs. Letterman. Dr. Lee was an assistant surgeon on the U.S. medical staff and served at Douglas Hospital, which is a site in D.C. That incorporated the former home of Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, famous for the Lincoln-Douglas debate. So his home had been occupied in that way. And then Dr. John Hill Brenton, a Union surgeon from Pennsylvania. His primary contribution to the war's medical effort was his compilation of a medical history of the war and his role in the establishment of the Army Medical Museum. And it's worth noting also that Brenton was a first cousin to General George Brenton McClellan, who had been commander of the Army of the Potomac on 2 occasions. There's one other person, a Dr. William Thompson, who was a friend of Dr. Brenton and is therefore likely the same Dr. William Thompson from whom Britannia collected rent in 1863. It's a common enough name, and there were a number of Dr. William Thompsons, but we think it's the same person. He had been Jonathan Letterman's chief of staff, and like Brenton, contributed to the establishment of the Army Medical Museum. So by taking in Union officers like these, Britannia possibly saved Tudor Place from the fate of its brother estate in Arlington, or the Stephen Douglas House, or the Georgetown Female Seminary. But always mindful of her Southern roots, Britannia recalled her cousin Barbara Dunlop after witnessing Britannia serving meals to Union officers, chiding her and saying, "What would your mother say to this?" To which Britannia replied, "She would have given me great credit for doing what necessity required." So that is the story of Tudor Place and the Civil War hospitals of Georgetown. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening and for your kind attention. I've really enjoyed exploring this topic, and I want to continue to do more research on this. If you have information that you would like to share on the subject, please send it to me. Here's my email address, mhudson@tudorplace.org. I also want to express my thanks to Terry Reamer. I'm not sure if Terry's on the call this evening, but She's a researcher at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and she helped me a great deal with the research on these hospitals. And I also want to acknowledge the research that was done by our former archivist here, Wendy Kale, who did the research on the Union officers who were the boarders here at Tudor Place. So if you'd like to learn more, and Katie, if you want to put those, put some of these links up in the chat, there are several places that you can learn more about the subject. And one is the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. They're headquartered in Frederick, but they also operate the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum here in Washington. And they have an amazing website as well. A lot of what I learned in preparation for this lecture about Civil War medicine, I picked up from their website. So they have just all sorts of articles, blogs, videos. There's educational resources for teachers. So you go to civilwarmed.org. There's also another great site if you're interested in a lot of topics on just the Civil War in Washington, and it's simply called Civil War Washington. The address is Civil War DC, and this is a site that's operated surprisingly by the University of Nebraska. It's a project that's funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And then if you would like to learn more about the Civil War years here at Tudor Place, you can find Wendy Kale's article. I think it's just entitled Tudor Place on the Civil War Home Front. And you can find it at our website at the address here. It's in our virtual library. So I think we have a few more, few minutes left for any questions. I haven't been following the chat, so I'm not sure if there have been a lot of questions that come up, but I'd be happy to answer any. Katie, any questions?
Yeah, one of them you've actually already addressed, and that was, did you know why the Union Hotel Hospital closed in 1863, which we discussed. It was a temporary hospital that might have been only there for the Battle of Manassas, too, or because of the Pavilion Hospital's opening. The second question, what that is already in the chat, and folks feel free to add more questions to the chat as we go along, was if Roosevelt Island was a Union or Confederate territory during the Civil War.
Oh, that's a good question. I do not know the answer to that, but I would say fairly soon after the beginning of the war, the Union Army would occupy that side of the Potomac. So whether it was in Virginia or whether it was considered, I assume it was considered in Virginia, but it would have been it would have been occupied by the Union. But I don't know anything about particular activities there, and hopefully maybe somebody knows.
I did some quick Googling during your presentation because I was curious.
Okay.
And it was occupied by the Union. It became an Army training camp and then housed formerly enslaved individuals during the Civil War and then post-Civil War for a little bit. So
great.
A quick fun fact about it.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Google.
Yeah. I also have another question for you, Mark. I was wondering what was the most surprising thing you came across in your preparation for this lecture?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think part of it was that sort of temporary nature of some of these hospitals as well. I didn't know that when I first embarked on this. I knew that there were 7 hospitals in Georgetown, and I had made the assumption they were there for most of the war. And so I think that's an interesting part of the story as well. And the other thing was just this, it's an obvious point, I think, but it was something that I heard in a podcast from the Museum of Civil War Medicine, was just this idea that most of the surgeons who were enlisted for this service had no experience with this. Most had never treated a gunshot wound. And that's just astonishing to think about. So to think about a very steep learning curve for these doctors, for these surgeons who were treating the wounded from battle.
Yeah, I was struck by the newspaper articles always pointing out that it was very clean and neat in the hospitals, when perhaps that was not the truest.
I think there was some morale building that the newspaper was trying to do, and portraying things. And I think there was a very intentional purpose too in reporting upon these Christmas dinners and things like that. I think they were intending to just make people feel good about what was happening on the home front. Yeah.
I don't see any other questions in the chat unless anyone has anything else to enter. Mark, did you have any closing statements that you would like to make before we wrap up?
Well, as always, yeah, I have the sort of dual role this evening as speaker and as director of Tudor Place. So I would first of all encourage anyone who's joining us this evening who would like to become a member of Tudor Place to visit our website and do that, or if you would like to make a contribution in support of what we do here. Also, just encourage you to keep track of what's going on. Visit our website, tudorplace.org. I should know what the next lecture is off the top of my head, and I don't, but it's coming up in September. Katie, you know.
Our next landmark lecture is September 21st from 6:30 to 8. It's going to focus on the role of women in slavery in Georgetown.
Okay. So we invite you to that, and just to remind everybody too that we are open on weekends. So please come by, pay us a visit the grounds. We have the first floor of the historic house open for visitation. So hope you'll join us for that.
Yeah, and check out our calendar for especially family programs that are upcoming in the next couple of months.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone,
Great.
for attending.
Thanks. Have a great night, everybody. Drive safely.